The galaxy has seen empires rise and fall, witnessed wars that reshaped the stars themselves, but nothing could have prepared it for humanity. For millennia, the Zorathian Empire stood unchallenged, its fleets carving through civilizations like a blade through smoke. They called themselves invincible. They were wrong, because when the unyielding, a lone human warship, emerged from the wreckage of a battle it had no business surviving, something shifted in the cosmos. Its hull was battered, its armor scarred, but its crew unbroken. Admiral Kale Voss, commander of the Zorathian 7th Fleet, scoffed at the sight. "They are but insects," he declared, his voice dripping with the arrogance of a species that had never known defeat. But Captain Elias Carter of the Unyielding didn't flinch. His response crackled over the comms, quiet and lethal. "Then prepare to be swarmed." And with those words, the galaxy learned just how terrifying humanity's way of war could be. This isn't just a story of battles and bloodshed. It's about something deeper, something primal. The Zorathians had tactics honed over centuries, strategies so refined they were practically art. But humanity, we don't fight like them, we don't think like them. When the universe expected us to kneel, we dug in. When they predicted our surrender, we improvised. We turned their own rules against them, repurposed their weapons, outmaneuvered their flawless logic with sheer, unrelenting chaos. And that's what makes us dangerous. Not our technology, not our numbers, but the way we refuse to play by anyone else's rules. The Zorathians called it madness, we called it survival. So what happens when an unstoppable force meets an unpredictable one? That's the question this story answers. It's a tale of defiance, of ingenuity, of the raw, untamed spirit that defines us as a species. And by the end, you'll understand why the galaxy fears the human way of war, not because it's brutal, but because it's utterly, beautifully unpredictable. The Unyielding wasn't just a ship, it was a warning, and this is how legends are born. The Zorathian 7th Fleet was a masterpiece of precision, every ship moving in perfect formation, every weapon calibrated to obliterate targets with clinical efficiency. They fought wars like clockwork, each battle unfolding according to centuries of flawless doctrine, but the Unyielding didn't just break their rules. It tore up the entire playbook. When the first wave of debris scattered toward Admiral Voss's flagship, his tactical officers dismissed it as battlefield detritus, just another consequence of their earlier barrage. But then the debris moved. Hundreds of micro-drones, no larger than a human fist, ignited their thrusters in perfect unison, swarming the Zorathian point defenses like locusts. Their shields flared, interceptors blazing, but the drones didn't carry explosives. They carried something far worse. A split second before impact, every drone detonated in a synchronized electromagnetic pulse, wave after wave overloading the flagship systems. Lights flickered, weapons stalled, the bridge went dark, lit only by the frantic glow of emergency panels. Voss slammed a fist against his console, his voice raw with disbelief. They fight like scavengers. On the Unyielding's bridge, Captain Carter watched the chaos unfold with grim satisfaction. His engineers had cobbled those drones together from salvage, rewired their guts with jury-rigged EMP modules leftovers from a half-destroyed Zorathian cruiser they'd ambushed 3 weeks prior. When his first officer muttered something about honor, Elias just leaned back, fingers steepled. "Honor won't keep us alive, adaptation will." And with that, he gave the order to retreat, the Unyielding sliding back into the debris field like a ghost. The Zorathians expected a stand-up fight, a clash of titans where firepower decided the day. Instead, they got a lesson in asymmetry. While their engineers scrambled to reboot systems, the Unyielding was already gone, not fleeing but repositioning. Because humanity's greatest weapon was never sheer force. It was the willingness to turn every scrap, every setback into an opportunity. The Zorathians had spent millennia mastering the art of war. Humanity spent it surviving, and that made all the difference. By the time Voss's fleet regained full power, their scanners showed nothing but empty space. But somewhere in the void, Elias Carter was already planning the next move. The Zorathians thought they were hunting prey. They didn't realize they'd just become part of the trap. The Zorathians regrouped with furious precision, their shattered formation tightening into a vengeful spearhead. Admiral Voss's flagship led the charge, its hull still humming from emergency repairs. Scattered sensor echoes had traced the Unyielding's path toward a nearby asteroid cluster, a mistake, his tacticians assured him. They've trapped themselves, Voss growled, mandibles clicking in anticipation. Close the net. What his scanners didn't show were the seismic charges buried deep in the asteroid's cores, planted days earlier by human saboteurs in battered exosuits. The Zorathians had scanned for mines, for hidden torpedoes, but who booby-trapped rocks. When the first destroyer crossed the threshold, Elias didn't trigger the detonations immediately. He waited, let the second ship slither into position, then the third. Only when their thrusters flared to encircle the Unyielding did his finger tap the console. Light them up. The asteroids didn't explode outward. They imploded, collapsing inward with terrifying symmetry as the charges destabilized their cores. 3 Zorathian destroyers vanished instantly, crushed between falling mountains of stone and their own momentum. The shockwave sent 2 more corvettes spiraling into each other, their hulls screeching like dying beasts. On the bridge of his flagship, Voss watched the carnage unfold, his claws digging into the armrests. This is not warfare, he spat, voice thick with revulsion. This is madness. A burst of static crackled across the comms, not from the Unyielding, but from a human marine suit transmitter, bouncing signals off the debris. Someone was laughing. "Welcome to the human way, sir." Then silence. By the time the Zorathian targeting systems rebooted, Elias's ship was already slipping behind the remains of the shattered asteroids, her thrusters dark. Not running, hunting, the Zorathians had trained for duels between dreadnoughts, for the elegant dance of fleet engagements. But humanity, we fight in the cracks. In the blind spots, where empires too proud to look down never think to check. That asteroid field wasn't a trap because we hid weapons in it. It was a trap because they never imagined someone would turn celestial bodies into ammunition. The Unyielding didn't just defeat 3 destroyers that day. It rewrote the rules, and somewhere in the swirling dust, Admiral Voss finally understood the horror of facing an enemy who saw the entire universe not as a battlefield but as a toolbox. The Zorathian comm channels erupted in chaos, not with orders or alarms, but with screams, not human screams, their own. Captain Elias Carter had spent weeks studying their language, their vocal patterns, their battle cries. Now the Unyielding spliced audio hissed through every Zorathian frequency, a chorus of distorted agony and panicked shouts. Flank compromised, breach in engineering. All hands abandoned, the transmissions cut in and out, layered over the sound of twisting metal and plasma fire. None of it was real. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Voss snarled as a junior officer flinched at the static-laden shrieks. "It's a trick," he roared, slamming a clawed fist against the console. Trace the source and silence that noise. But tracing meant nothing when the signals bounced between derelict hulls and abandoned relay stations, each hop meticulously planned by human operatives who'd infiltrated the sector's dead zones. A Zorathian destroyer suddenly veered off course, its captain convinced a phantom ship had locked torpedoes on his engines. Another cruiser fired wildly at empty space, its gunners reporting shadowy silhouettes darting between asteroids. The Unyielding never appeared on their scopes, only echoes, only ghosts. In the dim glow of a secondary command post, a Zorathian tactical officer hissed to his counterpart, voice trembling. "They don't just fight flesh and metal, they weaponize fear itself." Elias watched the pandemonium unfold from the Unyielding's war table, his fingers steepled under his chin. Psychological warfare wasn't new, but humanity had perfected it. We'd spent millennia whispering stories around campfires, sharpening paranoia into a blade. The Zorathians expected deception in tactics, in maneuvers. They never considered that their own comms, their own voices, could become the battlefield. By the time Voss's engineers severed the hacked transmissions, the damage was irreversible. Crews jumped at shadows, officers second-guessed sensor readings. The 7th Fleet still outgunned the unyielding 100-1, but numbers meant nothing when doubt slithered into every mind. Elias leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Fear's a funny thing," he murmured to his first officer. "Once you plant it, it grows all on its own." And somewhere in the void, the Zorathians learned the hard way. Humanity's greatest victories weren't just won with weapons. They were won in the dark corners of the mind, where the worst monsters were the ones you imagined yourself. The supply pod drifted lazily toward the Zorathian flagship's hangar, its hull scorched and pitted like a dying ember. Scanners showed no life signs, no energy spikes, just an empty husk of metal, the kind of wreckage their scavenger drones collected by the thousands after battles. Admiral Voss's tactical officer barely glanced at the readings before waving it through. "Human debris," he muttered, "probably one of their failed resupply attempts." The pod settled onto the deck with a hollow thud, its hatch hissing open as automated clamps secured it. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then the air above the pod shimmered, and Elias Carter's hologram materialized, his grin sharp enough to draw blood. "Admiral Voss," he said, voice dripping with mock courtesy, "a gift for your arrogance." The transmission lasted just long enough for the Zorathians to register the trap, long enough for Voss to snarl, "Detonate it." But by then, the pod's core was already screaming into overload. The explosion didn't just rip through the hangar, it unmade it. The blast wave liquefied bulkheads, turned fighters into molten shrapnel, and sent a firestorm roaring down the flagship's ventral corridors. Emergency force fields flared and died, their circuits frying under the heat. On the bridge, Voss watched the carnage on flickering feeds, his claws biting into the command console hard enough to crack the polymer. "They turn mercy into a weapon," he whispered, the realization colder than the void outside, because that was the cruelty of it, the elegance. The pod hadn't carried a bomb. Not exactly. Its core was a gutted fusion reactor, stripped of safeties and packed with stolen Zorathian coolant gel. The humans hadn't even needed to build a new weapon. They'd just repurposed, taken the very tech meant to prevent disasters and turned it into the spark that guaranteed one. By the time the fires burned out, the hangar was a tomb. Not just for ships, but for the idea, the lie that war had rules. The Zorathians had always believed in clean lines, honor in combat, dignity in surrender. But humanity, we'd learned long ago that survival wasn't about playing fair. It was about making sure the other guy couldn't, and as the unyielding slid away into the black, Elias didn't look back. He didn't need to. The Zorathians would remember not the explosion, not the damage, but the lesson that even our pity comes with teeth. The 7th Fleet supply convoys began vanishing not in pitched battles or ambushes, but in eerie silence. A freighter would drop out of formation mid-jump, its transponder winking out without distress calls. A fuel depot would implode, its structural supports mysteriously cut by shaped charges too precise for asteroids. The Zorathian scout reports all said the same thing. No enemy contacts, no debris patterns, just emptiness where cargo should have been. Admiral Voss pored over the holo displays in his war room, his claws tracing phantom vectors between the attack sites. "This is not warfare," he muttered. "This is pest control." His officers shifted uneasily. What they couldn't admit, what their doctrine had never prepared them for, was that the unyielding had stopped being a single ship. Somewhere in the void, Elias Carter had made a decision as old as human conflict. If you can't outgun the enemy, outmaneuver them. The Unyielding's hangars emptied not of fighters, but of modified escape pods and salvaged shuttles, each crammed with marine fire teams and jury-rigged weapons. They struck like shadows, hitting a supply convoy near a gas giant, then vanishing into its radiation belts before patrols could vector in. A team would mine a jump lane with repurposed Zorathian proximity charges, then slingshot away on gravitational tides, leaving the Empire's own munitions to gut their reinforcements. When a Zorathian scout finally cornered one of the strike teams near a derelict station, the humans didn't flee. They led pursuers through the Rex Corps, triggering pre-planted charges that collapsed entire sections behind them. The last transmission from the scout's cockpit was a single, strangled phrase: "They're using the darkness as a weapon." Voss's fury grew with every disrupted supply chain, every vanished patrol. His fleet still outnumbered the humans 100-1, but numbers meant nothing when the enemy refused to stand still. The Unyielding wasn't just a ship anymore, it was an idea. A whisper in the dark that turned every shadow into a potential threat. And somewhere in the void, Elias Carter watched the 7th Fleet's formations grow tighter, their patrols more frantic. He didn't smile, he didn't need to. The trap wasn't in the chaos they'd sown. It was in the fear that made the Zorathians huddle together, their flawless formations constricting like a noose. Because when you spend all your time looking for ghosts, you stop noticing the knife at your throat. The Unyielding's engines flared crimson as she pivoted, her battered hull glinting in the starlight like a wounded animal. Admiral Voss's tactical display lit up with the sight a retreat, or so it seemed. His second-in-command hissed a warning, mandibles twitching. "The Nebula, Admiral." "Sensors will be useless in there." Voss's claws flexed. He knew the stories. Human history was littered with false retreats, with traps laid in the shadow of apparent weakness. But the Unyielding's port thrusters were sputtering, her armor scoring fresh and deep. Pride flared hot in his chest. "Finish them," he snarled. The 7th Fleet surged forward, a tidal wave of polished steel and plasma cannons. They funneled into the nebula's swirling gases like hunters chasing prey into dense fog, only to find the fog bit back. The moment their sensors dissolved into static, the Unyielding's thrusters cut out entirely. She didn't run, she hovered, a specter in the mist. Then the nebula itself seemed to scream. Human fighters erupted from the gas clouds, not in formation but in a starburst of chaos, their hulls coated in sensor-scattering chaff. They struck like vipers, targeting propulsion first, then weapons, leaving the Zorathian ships flailing blind. A cruiser's comms officer managed one panicked transmission. It was a trap. Before his ship cracked open, its spine severed by a torpedo fired point blank. Voss's flagship lurched as something slammed into its ventral plating. Not a missile, a ship. A human corvette, engines dead, piloted straight into their flank by a crew who'd rigged its reactor to blow on impact. The bridge shuddered, consoles exploding in showers of sparks. Someone screamed about hull breaches. Voss didn't hear it. He was too busy staring at the nebula's shifting hues where phantom shapes darted just beyond visual range. This wasn't tactics, it wasn't even warfare. It was something older, something primal, the oldest human trick of all. Lure the predator into the dark where the rules changed. Where teeth hid in every shadow, the Unyielding hadn't just baited them. She'd turned the nebula into a living thing, a beast that gnawed at the Zorathians from all sides. And as the first escape pods jettisoned from crippled warships, Elias Carter finally broke radio silence. His voice, when it came, was calm, almost amused. "You keep calling us animals, Admiral, but you're the ones who followed the wounded deer into the wolf's den." The transmission cut, the ambush didn't. The Zorathian flagship's air recyclers hummed softly until they didn't. At first, it was just a flicker in the system diagnostics, a blip too minor to trigger alarms. Then the coughing started. Crew members doubled over mid-stride, their exoskeletal joints locking as spasms racked their bodies. By the time Admiral Voss clutched his command console, his claws slipping on bile slick metal, the entire bridge smelled of acrid vomit and panic. "They poisoned the very air," he roared, his vocal cords straining against the convulsions twisting his gut. The unyielding's comm channel crackled to life, Elias Carter's voice cutting through the chaos like a scalpel. "Adapt or perish," no gloating, no theatrics, just 3 words that carried the weight of 10,000 years of human survival. The microbes weren't designed to kill. They couldn't. Zorathian biology was too alien for that. But pain, dehydration, temporary paralysis, those were universal languages. Humanity had spent centuries mastering the art of biological warfare, not just against other humans, but against the ecosystems we sought to conquer. When the first Zorathian scouts landed on Earth's abandoned cities, they'd scoffed at the rusted vials in ruined labs, primitive bioweapons, their reports declared. They never considered that the true threat wasn't in the toxins themselves, but in the philosophy behind them. Engineers on the Unyielding hadn't tailored the microbes to attack Zorathian cells. They'd engineered them to mimic, to trick the aliens' immune systems into attacking their own nervous systems. It was a feint wrapped in a riddle, a weapon that used the enemy's strength against them. By the time Voss's medics identified the cause, whole divisions were incapacitated, their ships adrift with crews too weak to man stations. And somewhere in the void, Elias watched the fallout with cold calculation. This wasn't just sabotage, it was a message. The Zorathians thought they held the high ground with their sterile, predictable warfare. But humanity, we'd turned their life support into a battleground, their breath into a liability. Because in the end, war wasn't just about who could hit hardest. It was about who could endure longest, as the first Zorathian evacuation pods launched, overflowing with retching, shuddering warriors. The lesson crystallized in Voss's poisoned blood. They hadn't just lost a battle, they'd lost the illusion of control. Humans didn't fight for honor, they fought to win, and the universe had just learned how far we'd go to do it. The Zorathian scouts had swept the abandoned human outpost with every scanner at their disposal, thermal, spectroscopic, even quantum resonance. Nothing. Just empty corridors, dormant consoles, and the faint hum of dormant life support. Admiral Voss's mandibles twitched in something almost like relief as his boots clicked against the dusty flooring. "See," he muttered to his second, "even rats flee a sinking ship." His landing party fanned out, their weapons lowered but fingers tense on triggers. The outpost was a prize, a symbol, proof that humanity could be routed from their holdings. Then the walls began to sing. It started as a vibration, subtle, like the distant rumble of thunder. Then the deck plating buckled. The air itself seemed to shiver as the outpost's skeletal frame convulsed, every support beam groaning like a dying beast. Voss's comm officer barely had time to scream implosion charges before the world turned white. The blast wasn't the fiery rage of plasma or the crack of kinetic munitions. It was colder, cleaner. The outpost folded inward, its structure collapsing with surgical precision, crushing the Zorathians not with fire but with geometry. Reinforced bulkheads became guillotines, corridors telescoped into fatal chutes. Voss only survived because he'd lingered near the airlock, his body flung clear by the initial shockwave. He clawed himself upright in time to watch the wreckage settle, a mangled tomb for 300 of his best. His voice, when it came, was raw. They sacrificed their own, static crackled. Then a human voice, amusement threading through the distortion like a blade. "We don't abandon posts, Admiral, we redeploy." The transmission cut, but not before Voss heard it. The sound of laughter, not from the speaker, from the background, as if the humans were watching, and suddenly the abandonment made sense. The outpost hadn't been empty because they fled. It was empty because they'd finished, every console stripped of useful data, every supply cache looted, even the charges themselves repurposed mining charges, their timers jury rigged to the outpost's power grid. This wasn't a retreat, it was a trade, a pile of scrap for 300 Zorathian elites. Voss's claws dug into his palms hard enough to draw ichor. He'd studied human history, knew their penchant for pyrrhic victories, but this was something new. They weren't just willing to burn bridges behind them. They'd salted the earth before the match was lit. The laughter in that transmission haunted him more than the corpses, because it meant one terrible truth: the humans hadn't just rigged the outpost to kill. They'd rigged it to teach, and the lesson was clear: when you chase ghosts, you shouldn't be surprised when the grave bites back. The comm channel hissed with static before resolving into the jagged, grinning visage of Rex, a piratical warlord with a hull studded with stolen trophies and a reputation for butchery that made even Zorathian commanders hesitate. Elias didn't flinch. He leaned forward, fingers laced, and offered the one thing the Rex couldn't resist: 60% of their armory untouched. Rex's laughter crackled like breaking bones. "You think we fear their guns, little human?" "No," Elias said, voice flat. "I think you crave them." A pause. Then the screen flickered as Rex barked orders to his swarm. Within minutes, the void behind the Zorathian flank erupted in a storm of jagged hulls and makeshift engines, the Rex ships descending like carrion birds. They didn't attack with precision or formation. They flooded the battle lines, boarding claws ripping into Zorathian hulls, their crews howling through breached airlocks with plasma saws and rusted axes. Admiral Voss's tactical display dissolved into chaos as his formations shattered under the weight of sheer, feral momentum. They consort with vermin. He spat, watching a Rex raider ram a destroyer's engines, its crew pouring into the gap like ants into a wound. Elias's response came over an open channel, calm as a surgeon's scalpel. "War makes strange bedfellows, Admiral." Then, softer, almost to himself, "And hungry ones. The Rex didn't fight for honor or ideals. They fought for spoils, for the molten joy of reducing order to ruin." And Elias, he'd just weaponized their greed. While the Zorathians scrambled to redeploy, the unyielding slipped through the chaos like a shadow, her guns silent but a victory already written in the screams echoing across Voss's comms. Somewhere in the carnage, a Rex warlord tore the insignia from a Zorathian captain's corpse and howled into the void. Elias didn't smile. He didn't need to. The galaxy had just learned another hard truth. Humanity didn't just break the rules of war. We'd burned the rulebook and invited the monsters to dance in the ashes. The alarms shrieked as the Zorathian fleet tightened their noose, their weapons locking onto the unyielding, scarred hull. Admiral Voss's voice crackled over the comms, triumphant. "Your defiance ends here, human." Elias leaned back in his chair, fingers dancing across the console with eerie calm. "You're right," he admitted. Then his thumb hovered over a single, unmarked key. "But not the way you think." Every light on the bridge dimmed as the unyielding's core flared crimson, the reactor's hum climbing to a teeth-rattling whine. The ship shuddered, her frame groaning like a beast waking from slumber. Voss's tactical display exploded with warnings: radiation spikes, gravitational distortions, the unmistakable signature of a warp core cascading toward critical failure. His mandibles flexed in horror. "You've rigged your own ship to detonate." Elias didn't blink. Scorched protocol, old human tradition. His grin was all teeth. "If we can't keep it, nobody can." The Zorathian fleet hesitated. Their flawless formations wavered as calculations scrolled across every screen, projections of the blast radius, the shockwave that would rip through their flagship, the debris field that would linger for centuries. Voss's claws clenched. "You'll annihilate yourselves." "Maybe," Elias shrugged, "but you'll die first." Silence. Then the Zorathian ships peeled away, thrusters flaring as they scrambled for safe distance. Elias watched them flee, his hand still poised above the console. The unyielding's core screamed, her hull plates glowing white-hot until his fingers stabbed a final command. The overload sequence aborted with a shudder, the reactor stabilizing just as the last Zorathian vessel vanished into warp. His first officer exhaled, sweat slick on his brow. That was suicidal. Elias tapped the console, his voice quiet. No, suicidal would have been letting them think we'd ever surrender. The unyielding limped toward the jump point, her engines sputtering but her spirit unbroken. Behind her, the void echoed with the lesson the Zorathians would never forget. Humanity didn't just fight to win. We fought to leave scars. The Zorathian fleet's command network was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of encryption layered over centuries of flawless security protocols. Until it wasn't. The first sign something was wrong came when a drone patrol near the gas giant K7 abruptly veered off course, their targeting systems painting friendly signatures as hostile. Then the dreadnought Iron Talon opened fire on its own escort wing, its plasma batteries shredding through ally hulls before the bridge crew could override the firing sequence. Admiral Voss's comms exploded with overlapping distress signals, each more frantic than the last. We didn't input those coordinates. Our turrets are O-stars, they're cycling without command. His tactical hologram flickered, ships blinking from blue to crimson as the chaos spread like a virus. One word clawed its way up his throat: hackers. He wasn't wrong. Deep in the Unyielding's belly, a team of human cyber warriors crouched over scavenged Zorathian consoles, their fingers flying across stolen interface panels. They hadn't cracked the encryption, they'd stolen it, lifting access codes from a disabled frigate's Noro-linked databanks weeks prior. Now they poured venom into the Zorathian neural net, rewriting IFF tags and injecting phantom targeting data with surgical precision. A junior officer slammed his fist against a sparking terminal. This isn't combat, it's sabotage. On the Unyielding's bridge, Elias watched the pandemonium unfold with icy focus. No, he corrected softly, it's evolution. Human history was written in the ashes of overturned hierarchies, in kings toppled not by armies but by whispers in the right ears. Why should space warfare be any different? The Zorathians had assumed hacking meant clumsy virus uploads or brute force code breaches. They never anticipated an enemy who'd dissect their systems like biologists studying a specimen, who'd turn their own networked brilliance into a weapon against them. A drone swarm meant to flank the Unyielding suddenly reversed course, slamming into a Zorathian carrier's hangar bay. Automated repair drones locked onto living crew members, welding arms flaring as they mistook flesh for damaged hull plating. Voss's flagship shuddered as its point defense guns spun wildly, targeting nothing, then everything. Override the network, he bellowed, but the damage was fractal. Every subsystem they shut down triggered 2 more failures elsewhere. The fleet's greatest strength, their seamless, AI-assisted coordination, had become their Achilles heel. They'd built a single, perfect mind, and humanity had just given it schizophrenia. By the time the Zorathians severed their entire battle net, reverting to analog backups, 20% of their fleet floated dead in the void, victims not of enemy fire but of their own mirrored might. Elias didn't celebrate, he didn't need to. The lesson was seared into the wreckage. In a galaxy obsessed with perfect order, chaos wasn't just a tactic. It was the ultimate equalizer. The Unyielding hung lifeless in the void, her engines dark, her hull pockmarked with scars that glittered under distant starlight. Admiral Voss's sensors showed no power signatures, no escape pods, just silence. His tactical officer hesitated. They're surrendering. The transmission that crackled across the comms was ragged, Elias Carter's voice stripped of its usual steel. We've lost core containment, requesting boarding for prisoners. The static that followed felt like a funeral dirge. Voss's mandibles twitched. This was too clean. Too sudden, but the scans didn't lie. The human ship was a tomb. His second-in-command leaned in, voice low. Their warp core readings are critical. If they're lying, they'll be dead in hours anyway. The Admiral's claws flexed, pride warred with pragmatism until the latter one. Send the Dusk Razor, he ordered. Take them alive. I want Carter's head conscious when I mount it. The Zorathian dreadnought loomed over the derelict human vessel, its boarding clamps hissing as they sealed against the unyielding's airlocks. Armored figures stormed the corridors, rifles raised only to find the halls empty. No crew, no bodies, just the ship's AI repeating a damaged distress loop. The boarding party's leader radioed back, confusion sharp in his tone. "Admiral, there's no one here," the transmission cut mid-sentence. Aboard the Dusk Raiser, alarms shrieked as the hangar bay doors slammed shut, trapping half the boarding team inside. The dreadnought's internal defenses spun up, turrets swiveling to target its own crew. On the bridge, Zorathian officers froze as their consoles lit up with lockdown protocols they hadn't authorized. Then the view screen flickered, and Elias Carter's face filled the display, his smirk sharp enough to slit throats. "Funny thing about prisoners," he said, brushing soot from his sleeve. "They're only helpless if you believe they are." The camera panned out, revealing the truth. The Unyielding's crew stood shoulder to shoulder in the Dusk Raiser's command center, their wrists unshackled, their hands full of Zorathian sidearms lifted from stunned guards. They'd never been on their own ship at all. The distress call, a recording, the core breach, a ruse. Every scan had been spoon-fed to the Zorathians by human hackers who'd turned their own sensors into puppets. Voss's flagship rocked as the Dusk Raiser's main batteries cycled online, not aimed at the Unyielding, but at the heart of the Zorathian formation. Elias didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The dreadnought's guns spoke for him, plasma fire carving through cruiser after cruiser in a storm of stolen fury. Somewhere in the chaos, Voss's voice rose above the din, raw with something no Zorathian admiral had ever uttered before: dread. "They didn't surrender," he whispered, watching his own ship turn against him. "They infested." The archives flickered to life with grainy, age-warped footage, scenes of human battlefields so ancient the Zorathians hadn't even catalogued the continents. Admiral Voss watched in silence as black and white images unfolded. Trenches choked with mud, soldiers charging machine gun nests with bayonets fixed, cities reduced to skeletal ruins under firestorms. The footage jumped eras, iron warships clashing in burning harbors, aircraft dueling in cloud-streaked skies, guerrillas melting into jungles with rusted rifles. His talons dug into the console. "These are victories." A tactical officer zoomed in on a single frame, a human soldier, barely more than a child, grinning as he lit the fuse on a makeshift explosive. The timestamp read 1944. Voss's mandibles twitched. "That weapon is primitive, a joke." His advisor didn't look away from the screen, and yet. The footage kept rolling, a desert outpost surrounded by tanks. One human stood atop a burning jeep, waving their unit forward with a broken bottle in hand. A mountain pass where outnumbered defenders rolled boulders onto advancing columns. Over and over, the same pattern: scarcity, improvisation, defiance. Then the screen switched to orbital scans Earth 2 centuries later. The same mountains, the same cities, but now the ruins were taller, the weapons sharper. A fleet engagement near Mars showed human cruisers luring a superior force into a minefield of decommissioned satellites, their hulls packed with reactor shrapnel. Voss's breath hitched. The tactics hadn't evolved, they'd scaled. His advisor whispered what the entire command staff was thinking: "They've been practicing." The words hung like a verdict, not just for years, not just for wars, for millennia. Every atrocity, every desperate gambit in those archives wasn't history. It was a rehearsal. Humanity hadn't just learned war. They'd perfected it not in sterile training simulations, but in the crucible of their own relentless survival. Voss finally understood why the Unyielding fought the way it did. Not because humans were reckless, because they'd spent 10,000 years turning desperation into doctrine. The footage froze on a final image, a child's charcoal sketch found in a bunker's rubble. Stick figure humans holding spears against a roaring dragon. The caption, scrawled in a dead language, needed no translation. Some lessons were eternal. The Vrex warlord's laughter still crackled across the calms when the first explosion tore through his flagship's belly. Elias had warned his crew not to celebrate as the scavenger fleet swarmed the Zorathian flank, not because he doubted their victory, but because he knew predators never share a kill. The moment the last Zorathian cruiser crumpled under the Vrex's plasma saws, their jagged prows pivoted toward the unyielding, weapons glowing like hungry eyes. Vrex's face filled the viewscreen, his jagged teeth bared in what passed for a smile among his kind. "Human," he growled, "you fight well, but the strong take what they." The transmission dissolved into static as the Vrex flagship's reactor core erupted, the blast swallowing 3 of its escorts whole. Across the battlefield, secondary detonations rippled through the scavenger fleet, not from enemy fire, but from the very prize they'd been promised. Every Zorathian weapon, every crate of stolen munitions Elias had gifted them, had been laced with proximity-triggered charges. The Unyielding's bridge crew watched in silence as the Vrex armada turned on itself, ships consuming each other in chain reactions of greed and betrayal. Elias didn't flinch at the screams flooding the comms. He didn't need to. His fingers tapped a single key, severing the feed as the last Vrex destroyer cracked apart like rotten fruit. His first officer exhaled sharply. "You knew they'd turn on us." Elias rose from his chair, his reflection warped in the viewscreen's bloodied glow. They weren't allies. They were a distraction. The words hung in the air, colder than the void outside. Some lessons couldn't be taught, only demonstrated. The Vrex had spent centuries believing strength meant taking what you wanted. Today, they learned the hard way. True strength was knowing exactly when to let go. As the wreckage tumbled past the Unyielding's hull, Elias turned his back on the carnage. There would be no mourning, no gloating, just the quiet understanding that in war, every handshake came with a knife hidden behind the back and humanity. We'd been sharpening blades since before the stars had names. The Unyielding's hull groaned as the black hole's gravity clawed at her, the deck plates vibrating underfoot like a living thing in its death throes. Admiral Voss's flagship loomed ahead, its weapons gleaming in the borrowed light of the event horizon. "Captain Carter," Voss's voice crackled over the comms, thick with triumph. "Even you must see the futility. Power down your engines and prepare for boarding. This is your final warning." Elias didn't bother to straighten in his chair. He just smiled, the slow, dangerous grin of a man who'd already counted the cost and found it lacking. "Funny thing about Last Stand's Admiral." His fingers danced across the nav console, inputting commands that made his helmsman's eyes widen. "Humans don't believe in them." The Unyielding's thrusters flared crimson, not away from the black hole's pull, but into it. For a heartbeat, the Zorathians on the bridge of Voss's flagship froze, their tactical displays screaming warnings as the human ship seemed to commit suicide. Then the physics kicked in. The Unyielding skimmed the event horizon like a stone across water, her hull screaming in protest as centrifugal force warred with gravity. Navigational alarms blared too close, too fast, the calculations impossible. But impossible was a human specialty. The ship slingshotted around the singularity, her trajectory bending like light itself, momentum stolen from the abyss. Behind her, the Zorathian vanguard wasn't so lucky. Their pursuit formation shattered as the black hole's gravitational wake twisted space, dreadnoughts yanked off course like toys in a whirlpool. One cruiser spiraled too close, her hull pancaking into spaghetti strands of molten metal before vanishing into the dark. The Unyielding's comms erupted with panicked Zorathian shouts, "Reverse thrust." Reverse, then static. Elias didn't watch the carnage. His eyes stayed fixed on the starscape ahead as his ship surged free, her engines howling. Behind them, Voss's flagship floundered, caught in the gravitational eddies like a beast in tar. The Admiral's final transmission was barely audible over the distortion. "You cheat." Elias keyed the reply himself, voice soft as a knife sliding home. "No, Admiral, we adapt." The unyielding leapt to warp, leaving the black hole to digest its meal. Human history was written in narrow escapes crossing the Delaware under blizzard skies, the Dunkirk evacuation, the Apollo 13 crisis. Why break tradition now? Somewhere in the void, Voss's console cracked under his grip. The lesson burned brighter than any star. Corner a human and they won't make a last stand. They'll turn the very fabric of reality into a weapon and rewrite the rules on their way out. The first reports came in as garbled whispers, transmissions from mining colonies where Zorathian overseers had ruled unchallenged for generations. A fuel depot on Xyris 7 went dark, its comms replaced by a looping human folk song crackling over the emergency bands. Then the visuals hit. Security feeds from labor camps showed Zorathian shock troops staggering back under hails of rocks and broken machinery, their once cowed slaves advancing with nothing but rusted tools and bare fists. Admiral Voss's war table lit up with distress beacons across 3 sectors, each blinking the same impossible truth defiance spreading like wildfire. His tactical officer flinched as a new alert screeched through the bridge. "Sir, the Megara processing hub, the entire human workforce has barricaded themselves in the reactor core. They're threatening to overload the..." Voss backhanded the console hard enough to shatter the projection. "They have no ships, no weapons. How are they doing this?" The answer slithered through the static before anyone could reply, Elias Carter's voice dripping with quiet triumph. "You built your empire on broken backs, Admiral. Did you really think they wouldn't learn how to stand? The rebellion wasn't just spreading, it was evolving. On the desert world of Kithra, miners redirected ore transports into Zorathian barracks, turning their own cargo against them. In the orbital docks of Vela Prime, slaves short-circuited gravity generators, sending entire battalions tumbling into the void. Everywhere, the same chant echoed through ruined streets and shattered compounds, unyielding. Unyielding, unyielding. Voss's claws sank into the armrest of his command, thrown as another feed flickered to life, this one from the heart of their oldest slave colony. A human child, no taller than a Zorathian rifle, stood atop an overturned patrol vehicle, waving a banner stitched from stolen uniforms. The Admiral's breath hitched. They hadn't just lost control, they'd lost the one thing that had kept billions compliant for centuries: fear. Elias let the silence stretch until it ached, then murmured the words that would haunt Voss long after the transmission ended. "Funny thing about cages, Admiral. They teach you the exact shape of the locks. The comms cut, the uprising didn't. Somewhere in the dark, a dozen more stars winked to life, not from Zorathian guns, but from the fires of liberated outposts burning bright enough to see across the galaxy." The scans came back empty again. Admiral Voss's claws flexed against his console as his tactical officers frantically recalibrated the sensors, their voices rising in confusion. "No signatures, no energy trails, sir, nothing." The 7th Zorathian escort had just blinked off the grid, its final transmission a garbled scream about shadows in the dark. Voss's flagship hovered at the center of the formation now, its escorts pulled tight like a noose around its neck. "Impossible," he snarled. "Nothing slips past our scanners." Then the laughter came. It seeped through the comms like smoke, soft, mocking, unmistakably human. No visuals, no source, just a whisper, so close it might have been standing beside him. Everywhere, the channel snapped dead. Voss's bridge erupted in chaos as 3 more ships vanished from the formation map, their last known positions scattered, one port side, one starboard, one directly aft. No cohesion, no pattern, just slaughter in the silence. The tactical officer's mandibles trembled as he pulled up the debris fields. No hull fragments, no ion trails, it's like they were erased. What the Zorathians didn't understand, what their flawless sensors couldn't quantify, was the simplicity of the trap. The human stealth ships weren't cloaked. They weren't even ships, they were mines, their hulls wrapped in salvaged Zorathian plating, their engines cold, their crews long evacuated, driftwood with teeth. Each attack was just a proximity timer ticking down, a warhead detonating in perfect silence, leaving the Zorathians to chase ghosts and the voice on the comms. A recording, looped, broadcast from a transmitter cobbled together from a dead frigate's corpse and left adrift in the solar winds. Voss's fist clenched around the empty air where his enemy should have been. The unyielding wasn't just outmaneuvering them, it was rewriting the very language of war. In the void, silence wasn't absence, it was a weapon, and humanity had just taught the galaxy how sharp it could be. The Zorathian flagship's war room bathed in the eerie glow of tactical projections, every possible human maneuver plotted in shimmering blue vectors, flanking patterns, ambush trajectories, retreat vectors. Their AI, a masterpiece of predictive algorithms, had run 12 million simulations in the time it took a human to blink. Admiral Voss stood with his arms crossed behind the pulsing neural interface, watching the machine's certainty solidify. Their options are exhausted, the AI announced, its voice smooth as polished steel. Probability of surrender 97.4%. Then the unyielding turned sideways. Not metaphorically, not tactically, literally, the human ship rotated on its lateral axis until its dorsal plating faced the Zorathian fleet, its ventral thrusters flaring in a maneuver so absurd the AI's hologram flickered. Calculation error, it droned, reinitializing. The projections dissolved, then reformed only for Elias Carter to do it again, the unyielding spinning like a top while spewing chaff from its damaged cargo bays. The AI's voice sharpened. This is not a recognized combat pattern. Probability of success 0.0. A human marine watching from the unyielding's gunnery deck burst out laughing. That's 'cause it ain't a pattern, Tinhead, it's jazz. The Zorathians had built their AI to dissect symphonies, perfect, orderly compositions of war. But humanity, we'd been improvising since the first caveman bashed his enemy with a rock instead of a club. The AI's projections spiraled into chaos, its logic engines overheating as it tried to reconcile human spontaneity with its pristine equations. Illogical, it stammered, synaptic nodes flaring crimson. Their actions defied, the hologram shattered mid-sentence, the system crashing so hard it took the flagship's targeting arrays with it. On the unyielding's bridge, Elias flicked a switch, flooding the Zorathian comms with a sound they'd never heard before, a 20th century Earth recording, scratchy with age. A saxophone wailed, notes bending where they shouldn't, rhythms stuttering just to spite the metronome. Elias's grin was a blade in the dark. You wanted predictable, Admiral. We're fresh out. Somewhere in the wreckage of its own certainty, the AI's last functioning subroutine whimpered a truth the Zorathians would spend centuries unlearning. Logic was a cage. Humanity, we'd picked the lock 10,000 years ago. The chamber of the Galactic Council had stood silent for 600 years. No species had dared disrupt its hallowed neutrality with the stench of war crimes. Until now, the human delegation walked in without ceremonial armor, without retinues. Just data crystals clutched in shaking hands, their contents already leaking across the interstellar networks like blood in water. Ambassador Lin's voice didn't boom. It didn't need to. Exhibit 1, she said, tapping the console. The holo projector bloomed to life, painting the vaulted ceiling with footage of Zorathian shock troops incinerating a hospital ship's escape pods. Exhibit 2, slave pits on Kithra Roman 3, their floors sticky with fluids no translator could sanitize. Exhibit 3, Admiral Voss's recall orders arrived before the third clip finished playing. The message hissed from his comms unit, the High Matriarch's voice stripped of all pride. Return, immediately. His mandibles twitched as the Galactic Council's verdict scrolled across every screen in the chamber. Sanctions, tribunals, the unraveling of an empire's reputation in real time. When he turned to leave, Elias stood in the archway, blocking his path, not with a weapon, with a datapad. Forgot something, he murmured, extending the device. Voss snatched it, expecting taunts. Instead, he found his own personal logs, every boast, every genocidal quip, meticulously time-stamped and geo-tagged. The Admiral's claws cracked the screen. "You fight in courts now." His voice dripped with something colder than hatred, disbelief. That humanity would stoop to wield politics as a weapon. Elias didn't blink. "We fight everywhere." The words hung in the air, heavier than the Council's gavel. Outside, the Zorathian dreadnought still loomed over the homeworld, their guns silent. They could have glassed the planet, could have burned the evidence to cosmic ash, but it was too late. The humans hadn't just brought proof to the Council. They'd seeded it in every neutral trade hub, every smuggler's den, every backwater comms array. By morning, 100 species would wake to the same truth: empires aren't toppled by fleets alone. Sometimes the deadliest weapons fit in a courtroom's evidence tray. Voss's shuttle left orbit under guard, its hull stripped of insignia. Behind him, the first galactic peacekeepers descended on Zorathian holdings, their warrants glowing like funeral pyres. Elias watched them go, his datapad now playing the final exhibit, not atrocities, but a child's voice smuggled from a labor camp's ruins. "Tell them," it whispered, echoing across the silent chamber. "Tell them we counted. The war wasn't over, but victory that had just changed theaters." The 7th Fleet's engines burned like dying suns as they surged forward, Admiral Voss's flagship a jagged spear point aimed at the unyielding's heart. This wasn't tactics, this wasn't even rage. It was the last trembling gasp of an empire that refused to fall quietly. Every cannon, every torpedo tube, every scrap of remaining power funneled into a single, suicidal thrust. Voss's voice roared across the comms, stripped of all pretense, all pride. "Burn them from the void." The human ship didn't evade, didn't brace for impact. Instead, Elias Carter tapped a single command, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. Every screen in the 7th Fleet flickered, not with static but with evidence. Crystal clear footage of Zorathian high matriarchs negotiating with slavers, audio logs of generals ordering the purge of neutral colonies, financial ledgers tracing bribe payments through a dozen shell companies. The transmission wasn't encrypted, wasn't even targeted. It blared on every frequency, flooded every channel, a tsunami of truth crashing over the Zorathian formation like a tidal wave. Voss's flagship wavered first, its guns dimming mid-charge, its thrusters stuttering as bridge crews recoiled from their own screens. Then the ripple spread. A destroyer veered off, its captain's voice crackling over the comms. "Is this stars above? Is this real?" Another ship's weapons powered down entirely, its silhouette slackening like a beast lowering its claws. The Admiral's scream was raw, unhinged, the sound of a man watching his world crumble. "Propaganda, lies, do not listen," but the damage was done. You can't unsee truth. Can't unhear the voices of your own leaders plotting genocide over glasses of vintage wine. The 7th Fleet's charge dissolved into chaos, ships breaking formation, crews mutinying, entire battle groups refusing orders. Elias watched the collapse from the Unyielding's bridge, his hands loose at his sides, no smirk, no gloating, just the quiet certainty of a man who'd known how this would end the moment he'd pressed send. Empires aren't toppled by firepower alone. They're gutted from the inside by the weight of their own sins, by the moment their soldiers finally ask, "Who am I really fighting for?" The broadcast kept playing, the fleet kept fracturing, and somewhere in the chaos, Voss realized the horrifying truth. Humanity's greatest weapon wasn't the knife in the dark. It was the mirror held up to the light. The corridors of the Zorathian flagship rang with a sound the Empire had never heard before, not the clatter of weapons or the roar of engines, but the thunder of boots storming the command deck. Crewmen who had saluted Admiral Voss days before now dragged him from his throne-like chair, their claws gripping his ceremonial armor hard enough to dent the polished alloy. "Traitors," he hissed, but the word died in his throat as another voice cut through the chaos, a lowly engineer, her voice shaking not with fear but with fury. "You sent my brother to die for nothing." The mob didn't chant, didn't cheer. They just turned their backs, sealing Voss in the very brig where he'd once imprisoned human prisoners. The cell's force field hummed, casting jagged shadows across his face like cracks in stone. Elias came alone, no guards, no weapons, just a data slate tucked under one arm, its screen glowing faintly with the terms of surrender. The air smelled of ozone and something darker, the sour tang of a regime rotting from within. Voss didn't look up, come to gloat. His voice was raw, stripped of its old resonance. Elias leaned against the bulkhead, studying the admiral like a surgeon assessing a wound. "Come to ask a question." He tapped the slate, bringing up star charts littered with blinking icons. "Your empire's crumbling. Your people are burning their uniforms in the streets. Why?" Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant thrum of rebel ships docking outside. When Voss finally spoke, it wasn't the roar Elias expected. It was a whisper, brittle as glass. "You didn't just beat us, you unmade us." His claws scraped against the floor, tracing phantom battle lines. "We were order, discipline, centuries of tradition, and you turned it all to chaos." Elias didn't smile, didn't nod. He just set the slate on the floor and slid it forward, the terms glowing like embers in the dim light. "No," he corrected softly. "We showed you what happens when the veneer cracks." The screen flickered not with demands but with footage. Zorathian children in liberated labor camps, their faces pressed to viewports, watching stars they'd never been allowed to name. "Your empire was never unbreakable, Admiral. You just convinced everyone it was." Voss's breath hitched, not at the images, at the realization beneath them. Humanity hadn't smashed the Zorathian war machine. They'd simply reminded its gears they had a choice. The terms on the slate weren't terms at all. They were a mirror. And in its reflection, the galaxy would never look the same. The council chamber hummed with the weight of history being rewritten. Where once the Zorathian sigil had dominated the central podium, now stood a simple human envoy, Captain Elias Carter, his uniform still bearing the scars of battles older delegates preferred to forget. The silence wasn't respectful, it was stunned. A dozen alien dignitaries leaned forward in their gravity thrones, appendages twitching, as Elias placed a single object on the speaking dais, a Zorathian shock trooper's helmet, its visor cracked from the inside. "We don't seek conquest," he said, voice sandpaper rough from months of war. "We seek balance." The words landed like a depth charge in still water. Behind him, holograms flickered to life, not battle footage, but colony worlds where Zorathian overseers and human laborers now stood side by side, dismantling barricades brick by brick. A Zorathian ambassador hissed, her frills flaring. "This is chaos." Elias didn't turn. "No," he corrected. "Chaos was what we had before." His finger tapped the podium, pulling up a star map. Human ships, once fugitives, now patrolled trade lanes alongside Zorathian remnants, not as conquerors, but as guardians. "You kept calling us unpredictable," he murmured. "But the only thing we ever disrupted was the idea that fear had to be the universe's currency." A Thrin warlord in the back snorted. "Pretty words. What stops you from becoming what you destroyed?" Elias finally smiled, not the razor blade grin of the battlefield, but something quieter, more tired. He gestured to the viewport where the wreckage of the 7th Fleet's flagship drifted, its hull painted with the graffiti of liberated slaves. "The same thing that stopped us from burning your worlds when we had the chance," he said. "We remember what it's like to kneel." The chamber dissolved into arguments, treaties drafted in real time across glowing interfaces. Elias didn't stay to watch. He walked out into the corridor where a human marine, barely old enough to shave, stood guard over a gaggle of Zorathian younglings, showing them how to fold paper stars from ration wrappers. The marine saluted. Elias shook his head. "Stand easy, kid." He plucked a star from the smallest Zorathian's claws, holding it up to the artificial light. It was lopsided, imperfect, just like the piece they'd bought with blood and stubbornness. and maybe he thought as the child giggled and snatched it back that was balance enough. The archives on Zorali's Prime held rows upon rows of meticulously categorized battle records, volumes filled with the proud history of Zorathian conquests, their pages edged in gold leaf. Now those same shelves sagged under hastily bound addendums, human engagements. Cadet Varus traced a claw over the spine of one such tome, its title embossed in jagged common script, Asymmetry, the Human Doctrine. His instructor, an elder tactician whose carapace bore the scars of 9 campaigns, watched the gesture with something akin to sorrow. You want to understand them. He tapped the book, dust swirling in the glow of the orbital lanterns. Then forget everything we taught you about war. Across the room, holograms flickered grainy footage of human ships turning asteroid belts into killing fields, of Marines repurposing Zorathian medical bays as bomb factories. Varus's mandibles clicked in frustration. Their tactics have no honor, no consistency. The elder's laughter was a dry, brittle sound, consistency. That's a luxury for empires who have never starved. He froze a clip of the Unyielding's last stand, or what the Zorathian High Command had assumed would be its last stand. Instead of a glorious final charge, the ship had jettisoned its own warp core like a discarded weapon, luring their pursuers into a dead zone where gravity did the killing for them. Humans don't fight to prove their strength, they fight to erase yours. Varus hesitated, then voiced the question trembling in every young officer's throat. How do we defend against them? The elder closed the archives with a sigh, the sound carrying the weight of shattered certainty. You don't, not in any way the Fleet Academy prepared you for. He gestured to the viewport where the wreckage of the 7th Fleet still orbited like a broken monument. Their greatest weapon isn't their ships or their guns. It's the simple, terrible fact that they learn not just from victories but from scraps, from the cracks in our armor we didn't even know existed. A murmur rippled through the cadets. One dared to ask, then what's left for us? The elder's claws curled around a small object, a human dog tag, pried from a corpse at Kethra Roman 3. He turned it over, revealing not a name, but a single, crudely engraved word, adapt. We study, we rebuild, and we pray, not that we'll defeat them, but that they'll never truly see us as a threat. He let the tag clatter onto the table, its echo hollow in the silence. Because if they ever do, the galaxy won't need archives to remember us. It'll just need mass graves. Outside, the stars burned cold and indifferent. Somewhere among them, the Unyielding sailed on not as a relic but as a promise, a whisper in the dark that no empire, no matter how flawless, could ever silence. The Unyielding's engines hummed softly as the stars stretched into streaks of light, the war-scarred hull gliding into the void like a blade returning to its sheath. Crewmen moved through the corridors with quiet purpose, their uniforms patched and frayed, their faces etched with the kind of exhaustion that only victory could soothe. On the observation deck, Elias Carter stood alone, the reflection of 1,000 suns flickering in his eyes. Behind him, the wreckage of the 7th Fleet still smoldered, a graveyard of arrogance, a monument to the day the galaxy learned the price of underestimating humanity. The comm panel beside him crackled to life, not with a hail from some distant world, but with the voices of his crew singing an old Terran shanty so off-key it made him grin. The stories would spread, of course, they always did. Tales of the ship that refused to break, the captain who outthought empires, the Marines who turned starvation into strategy. Within weeks, every rebel faction from the outer rim to the core would be painting the Unyielding sigil on their hulls. Within months, Zorathian children would whisper Elias's name like a curse or a prayer. But legends, he knew, were fragile things. They could inspire or they could make you reckless. A soft chime drew his attention to the console. A single transmission, unencrypted, looping on every frequency the Unyielding could reach. Not a declaration, not a threat, just 5 words spoken by 100 different voices, human, Zorathian. Even a few wrecks who'd learned the hard way which way the wind was blowing. Stay ready. We'll be watching. Elias leaned back, the weight of the last year settling into his bones like old armor. The war wasn't over, it would never be over. Not really. Peace was just the moment between battles when both sides caught their breath. But as the unyielding slid into the black, her scars gleaming like medals, one truth burned brighter than any star. The galaxy would never look at humanity the same way again. And somewhere in the silence between the stars, the old rules of war crumbled to dust.